All right, so this question of trying to look now at the Pope Francis, question of contraception, and now the Zika virus, this major health crisis that's going on, particularly in the region of Brazil. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like. There are quite a range of ways that we could try to talk about this problem. And as I thought about this problem, I came up with a range of questions, of central questions that really directed how it is that I'll be talking about it today. I should also mention, by the way, I will try to keep this relatively brief. My hope is this will take about 45 minutes. We will then have some time for questions after. So please bear with me as I move through all of this. All right, so first question I wanted to address is this question of who is Pope Francis? I'm guessing you all know a little bit about him. He's certainly made plenty of news. But who he is, his personality, his actions certainly fit into this question. It's hard to understand what's going on without knowing something about Pope Francis. Also, I wanted to talk very briefly about the Zika virus. What is the Zika virus? And why is it an issue that is so problematic right now, particularly in connection with the Catholic Church? How is this all tied in? Also then, as some of you may know, Pope Francis actually spoke directly to this issue. He spoke about it on February 18th in a very brief comment, but one that has drawn quite a lot of media attention. And so I want to look more closely at his comments and what they might mean. Also then, and especially as you probably gathered hearing a little bit about my background, when I look at a question like this, I think of it particularly in historical terms. Where does this fit in the long history of Christianity? Also in theological terms. Christianity, of course, has a very rich, long tradition of theology, and these theological perspectives profoundly shape how it approaches a problem like this. Also then, finally, what can we really expect? What is the church likely to do in these circumstances? All right, now, before I move into this, let me also make a few other quick comments. As I approach a topic like this, it's probably worth mentioning my own background, as you gathered, very much a historian of religion, certainly a person who's fascinated by theology. And this topic, approaching a topic like this is an uncomfortable topic, I think it's fair to say. We will be certainly touching on issues of contraception, of abortion, possibly issues like divorce, homosexuality. These are issues that wiser men, frankly, would flee from, I think it's fair to say. Let alone trying to address these issues to an audience of largely college students. So what do you think? Is this the kind of stuff that makes you all feel very comfortable? That makes you excited to hear about? Well, I should also mention, as I start moving through this material, my own background, I am not Catholic. So I am not trying to be an apologist for the Catholic Church. However, I am deeply respectful of the Catholic tradition. And just as I would with any major religious tradition, I will try to represent its positions as clearly, as accurately, and as respectfully as I possibly can. I should also mention for you listening to this, because these topics are ones that are frankly uncomfortable, I am not trying to advocate any position for any of you. I am not trying to support a particular position with birth control. I am not trying to call you out on choices. That is absolutely not my intent. Got it? So if you do feel uncomfortable with these topics, please, as best you can, set that aside for a moment. Try as best you can to listen to and understand the framework for this discussion. All right. All of that said, I should also mention when I started approaching a topic like this, I also became very aware that my own background shapes how I approach this, including that I am a husband and a father, which certainly shapes this. And fittingly enough, I have my wife, who you just mentioned, a wonderful tech extraordinaire, as well as professor here. And I even have my son in attendance back in the back, my 5-year-old, who hopefully will be quiet throughout this. But certainly as a parent, as a husband, as a father, it shapes how you think this material. All right, so all of that as prolegomena. Let me turn now to talking a little bit about who is Pope Francis. Argentina, where he was a cardinal, and he was not seen as a likely choice. For some perspective, the people who've been chosen as popes for a very long time were drawn from Italy, and Italy exclusively, and then in more recent times drawn from Europe. So he is shocking in being a non-European pope. And chosen from Argentina, he of course closely aware of issues in Latin America, which we will be dealing with, of course, today. Also, when he was chosen, it was interesting, always intriguing, to see what a pope chooses as his name. A pope gets to choose his name, and he stunned the world again by choosing the name Francis. And Francis was widely thought to be one of those names that was untouchable. Because Francis of Assisi is such a famous person, such a huge figure in the life of the Catholic Church, that to pick the name of Francis, very, very shocking. Why did he choose the name of Francis? Well, this has a lot to do with his personality. And he's even spoken about it formally, particularly in a formal writing, one that was just a little over a year ago, an encyclical that he wrote on the environment. And in this encyclical on the environment, he addressed particularly Francis of Assisi, who of course deeply devoted to nature. And he said that he chose the name of Francis particularly as challenge for himself, as inspiration, and as guide for his personal choices. And when he looked to the figure of Francis, he saw someone who reached to those who were on the margins, to people who are often excluded, and who did so with joy, did so with humility, did so with compassion. And this is certainly much of what we can see in Francis's actions. In Pope Francis's actions. So, Pope Francis has made news a number of times. Not only has he traveled, and traveled quite a lot, traveling has become something very common for recent popes, particularly Pope John Paul II, famous for traveling to these places, traveling quite a lot in a way that popes had not traditionally done. Pope Francis not only travels quite a lot, but he also is frequently stepping outside of expected roles and doing things that are really quite startling, including to the people who are trying to watch out and attend him. And let me give you just a couple of examples. One recent example, he went and one of the people gathered nearby him, a random person from the audience, was drinking coffee, and he went and shared his coffee with him. Needless to say, all of his food tasters went crazy, right? Not the thing you expect him to do. Perhaps one you can relate to a little bit more. When he was in Buenos Aires, he needed to get prepared very rapidly for the Mass, didn't have a way to get dressed properly. So what did he do? He stopped in a Burger King, right? This is what all of you would do. He proceeded to stop in a Burger King to vest himself to go and then serve Mass. Is this a little bit surprising? It should be. This is not typical behavior of a pope, to put it mildly. He also was widely rumored, especially during the first year of his papacy, to sneak out of the Vatican at night in disguise and go and offer alms to beggars and care for the needy. Again, very surprising in a lot of his actions. He made quite a lot of news with this image here on the right, when he embraced a man with neurofibromatosis. And again, here's a person who I think many would shy away from. Pope Francis often in his actions, as well as his words, challenges people to see things perhaps in a different way, and treats people with compassion, with dignity, often in ways that are very striking, startling, even shocking. Now, Pope Francis, as I mentioned, travels quite a lot, including recently traveled to Mexico for an extended visit. And when he went to Mexico, he of course saw a number of the challenges there. He was greeted everywhere, and I can't tell you how many pictures there are of him receiving sombreros and smiling graciously as everybody wanted to give him a sombrero. And not surprisingly, in the midst of this, he also then encountered this challenge of the Zika virus, a topic of major concern in Mexico, even though, of course, its place of greatest occurrence right now is in Brazil. All right, so Pope Francis, shocking figure in his words, in his actions, compassionate, often now startling people by going outside of expected boundaries. So let me talk a little bit about the Zika virus, because I'm guessing while some of you may watch the news closely, know all about this, this may be a topic that is less familiar to you. So, very short version here of the Zika virus. Well, Zika virus, first of all, has been around for a very long time. But very recently, it has become much more prevalent, including especially in South America. And with the Zika virus, when you get sick with the Zika virus, it is not a particularly horrible disease. We have a description over here about what you can expect. Pretty much the illness is mild, symptoms lasting several days to a week, 2 to 7 days after being bitten by a mosquito. You get fever, joint, muscle, eye pain, rash. This is not very significant, right? So in general, the Zika virus, for most healthy people, it is not particularly a threat. But what happened is that suddenly they started seeing lots of birth defects. Large number of birth defects, including especially microcephaly, which I'll talk more about in a minute. Microcephaly now, children born with smaller heads, which can lead to all sorts of related health problems, including especially delay of development and long-term crises. Now, it was not clear at first whether or not these are connected. And this is an ongoing issue. It's only as recently as December that we started seeing lots of evidence that the two are linked. And this is something that is being studied in an ongoing way. Pretty good overview. That you understandably, see here, with this health crisis, how now this health crisis now affects pregnant women. In particular, and the likelihood or possibility, at least, warning of children. CDC, of course, American institution, warning people of the danger of going to these places and how it is that you should protect yourself. Now, let me pause for just a second to emphasize born with microcephaly. There have been health responses to this crisis. These regions that we're talking about, very heavily Catholic. Very, very heavily Catholic. This is a bastion of the Catholic Church and a large growth area for the Catholic Church as well. This is going to be important now for some of their advice. In particular, what's their advice going to be? It's going to be that if you are traveling to these regions and you're trying to become pregnant, that you want to certainly avoid mosquitoes. This certainly seems prudent, but also that you might consider using condoms. Now, why does this matter? This matters because the use of condoms, of this form of birth control, this is not acceptable within Catholic teaching. And I'll talk more about why, more about the background of that shortly. All right, so Zika virus now, this is a tiniest bit about it, but this issue, and this issue now of microcephaly, this is not an issue that we should be thinking of simply in terms of regions, simply in terms of advice that's given in terms of health, but it has a very human face. And it's important to think a little bit more closely about the human aspects of this disease. And this is certainly how a person like Pope Francis is going to encounter it. So, microcephaly. Well, microcephaly certainly occurs naturally. And in these regions, in Brazil, between the years 2000 and 2014, we saw 157 cases per year on average. So it does occurs with some frequency. In 2015, with this outbreak of the Zika virus, we've seen 574 cases. This is a marked increase. And of course, with this, there's been an interest in studying it and understanding, and the slow realization that it is directly linked to the Zika virus. Now, Here, I should also mention very recently, this is drawn from March 11th Morbidity and Mortality Report. So very, very recent study of this material. You can see here also images of these babies born with microcephaly, images of them being cared for by families, by healthcare workers. And again, for a person like Pope Francis, as well as for the church, this is not just a healthcare issue. This is not just a matter of statistics. This is something that has a very human and a very personal face. And you need to think of it that way. All right, so that's enough about the Zika virus, about Pope Francis. I want to get now to what started all of this, what sparked all of this, namely these comments that Pope Francis made. Comments that he made immediately after his trip to Mexico. He was on the plane back home, and often on these plane trips, he accepts interviews. And so there's this process now of meeting with the press. In this case, he spoke for an hour to the press. He was asked a whole series of questions. 12 questions in the space of an hour, asked to him in a range of languages, English, Italian, Spanish, and he had to address everything, to give you some perspective here, from questions about the Catholic Church and its handling, particularly of treatments of abuse, especially sexual abuse of children. He had to deal with issues of divorce, issues of same-sex marriage. He got asked the question that made a lot of news about Trump and the wall and immigration. Oh goodness, what other issues? A lot of touchy issues, to put it mildly. And this question gets asked about halfway through. And it's a very pointed question that he's asked. And this, of course, shapes the nature of his response to this question of birth control and the Zika virus. So, what's asked? What's asked now is, they say, for several weeks there's been this cause of great concern in many of the Latin American countries, and particularly with Zika virus and the risk to pregnant women. He says some authorities, and indeed they have, some government authorities, have proposed abortion or avoiding pregnancy. And this is still the questioner asking him. He says, with regard to avoiding pregnancy on this issue, can the church take into consideration the concept of the lesser of two evils? The lesser of two evils. So in this case, the question is essentially asking, is something like birth control the lesser of two evils than abortion? Now, I should mention this idea of lesser of two evils. This is not a Catholic theological idea, primarily. But this is an idea now asked by this questioner. Pope Francis's response. He responds, abortion is not the lesser of two evils. It is absolute evil. And it's in a more detail here. He goes on, actually, this has been excerpted out of it. He says it's a crime on the level of the mafia, killing somebody. And it is a human evil. It is murder. So he makes there's no wiggle room on that topic. He then goes into, he says, on the lesser evil, avoiding pregnancy, we speak in terms of a conflict between the fifth and sixth commandments. By the way, the fifth and sixth commandments, this is thou shalt not commit adultery and thou shalt not commit murder. And he sees it then as between these. He says, Paul VI, a great man in difficult situations in Africa, permitted nuns to use contraceptives in cases of rape. Do not confuse the evil of avoiding pregnancy by itself with abortion. He says, on the other hand, avoiding pregnancy is not an absolute evil. In some cases, as in this one, or in the one mentioned of Paul VI, it's clear. I also urge doctors to do their utmost to find vaccines against this disease. Work needs to be done on this. So these were his comments. These were the comments that he made back on February 18th on the plane back. And these comments, as you might expect, drew a lot of media attention. And people had all sorts of radical reactions. They came out of this and said, wow, the Pope has said contraception's okay. Go for it. Others said, well, wait a second. He didn't say contraception was okay at all. He said avoiding pregnancy is okay in this circumstance. And this is just a reinforcing, perhaps, of older Catholic ideas of the rhythm method or of abstaining from having sex. Now, with this, I should also mention that here, as he makes this comment, this also drew news people who started wanting a more radical reaction. Particularly, there's been ongoing debate about AIDS. AIDS in Africa, condom use with AIDS, and sure enough, people started saying, well, great that you're allowing contraception in this case, but shouldn't you now come out in support of condoms and AIDS as well? Now, let me emphasize, this statement that he made, this is not a very clear statement. Do you guys see that? This is not a clear statement saying, by the way, great, use contraception everywhere, absolutely A-okay. That is not what he says. Got it? Instead, he connects it to a really extreme example. An extreme example that some even question whether ever occurred, namely this issue under Paul VI, when nuns were being systematically raped, and they were then allowed by the church to avoid pregnancy through using oral contraceptives. Now, would you guys say that's relatively extreme? That is not something that is, for instance, closely related to a married couple having sex with the desire to have children, but being worried about having a child with microcephaly. Those are not equal. Do you guys see that? So again, this does not suddenly say that it's A-okay. What this does do probably is open it to conversation, and to do so in a way that is pretty surprising, because this is not a common sort of statement. It's no wonder that this made a lot of media attention. All right, well, what I want to do now is I want to try to put these comments in a little bit more perspective and hopefully offer a little bit more clarity on the Catholic Church's teachings on these issues and why they have those teachings. So, first of all, I want to step back quite a bit further to the Bible. The Bible and biblical understanding of issues like conception. And in particular, this is rooted in understandings drawn from the Hebrew Bible. God, of course, as he's understood within Judaism, within Christianity, is a creator God. A God who creates and who creates things good. And not only is God a creator God, but God is closely, intimately involved with conception. After he creates, he says to his creation, be fruitful and multiply. This blessing that he now offers to all of his creation, but also offers very particularly to humanity. And already, with the story of Adam and Eve, for instance, no sooner are they kicked out of the garden, but as Eve conceives for the first time, we're told in the Bible that she does so with the help of the Lord, with the help of God, however we interpret that. And it's not just with Adam and Eve, but in these ongoing stories, particularly in stories in Genesis, we see God frequently involved in these stories of conception. When we get to people like Abraham and Sarah, for instance, in their old age, unable to bear a child, God blesses them with a child. Does so much to their surprise, their shock. So much so, of course, that Sarah laughs. And her laughter taken now for the name of her child, Isaac, born to her. Also, it's closely intertwined with the covenants that are created, these relationships with God, particularly the covenant that is formed with Abraham, covenant that includes this promise that he will have many children, that his descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the heaven and the sands in the sea. God cares about procreation. Got it? He's intimately involved in it. And this involvement is going to continue into later stories in the Hebrew Bible. Great example, the story of Hannah. Hannah, unable to conceive, she goes, she prays to God. Prays to God, offers her child to God if God will help her conceive, which of course he does. And when he does, she then sings out in praise to God. Sings out in praise to God for his action on her behalf. If I were teaching a class like Women in the Bible, which I sometimes do get to teach and is wonderful, I would emphasize here, God, as he's understood in the Hebrew Bible, he, among other things, is one who opens and closes wombs. God is in charge and intimately involved in this act of procreation. Now, as we get to Christianity, of course, this continues. Not only does it build on the stories from the Hebrew Bible, but particularly when we get to founding story in Christianity, namely that of the virgin birth, pretty clear that God is decisively involved in procreation. God cares about procreation. God is present in the midst of it. All right, well, enough about the biblical story and God's involvement in creation and procreation. I want to talk a little bit about early Christianity and how it's going to see a related issue, namely the issue of abortion, of ending a life that has now begun. And we get this particularly clear in the Didache. The Didache, this is a text written probably around 100 CE, probably late in the first century. Clearly draws, particularly on Matthew and Luke. It is a very, very short document. It is a handbook, a guidebook for the early church, and it offers brief moral instruction, framed particularly as the way of life and the way of death. And it's very, very brief. And it includes familiar issues like the Ten Commandments. But along with these, we see now familiar things like you shall not commit murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not practice witchcraft, and then also you shall not murder a child by abortion, nor kill that which is born. And if you didn't get enough here in this brief statement, we then get, again, repeated when it turns to the way of death. It describes people who are murderers, adultery, lust, murderers of children, and destroyers of the handiwork of God. So already, by the end of the first century, the Didache, a text that is seen as authoritative within Christianity, a text that is included in many of the canon lists, just doesn't ultimately quite make it in the New Testament, comes out very, very firmly against abortion. Now, it's not just the Didache. This is going to be repeated by later Christian theologians. Clement, Augustine, all are going to continue to come out very strongly against abortion. And this is certainly a part of the teachings of the church, the teachings that we saw with Pope Francis, where he's going to say that this is not a relative evil, that abortion is seen instead as an absolute evil by the Catholic Church. It is murder, as the Catholic Church understands it. All right, well, if we can set aside the question of abortion for a moment, let me turn instead to this question of contraception, of birth control, as we would talk about it, of stopping somebody from becoming pregnant in the first place. Well, the defining example for this is now this encyclical Humanae Vitae. This is the official position of the Catholic Church. So, first of all, Humanae Vitae, fitting enough title here, on human life. It's given the subtitle, On the Regulation of Birth. And of course, it's centrally concerned with these issues. Let me say first what an encyclical is, because I'm guessing that may be an unfamiliar term for many of you. An encyclical is a formal statement by the Pope that is intended to be circulated. And that's what that word means, encyclical. It's intended to be circulated amongst the bishops and the teachers and leaders in the church, giving them instruction on an important issue. Encyclicals are rare. In the last 50, 60 years, they've been written roughly one every 2 years. So these are not common. They are very formal pronouncements, and they are seen as authoritative. This particular encyclical was issued in 1968, issued in the midst of course, radical changes in society. Among other things, the pill, common birth control, oral contraception, was becoming heavily used. We had, of course, women's movement, changing attitudes towards women and their bodies. Certainly the sexual revolution, major changes in society. How did the Catholic Church respond? It responded now with this formal statement of Humanae Vitae. And what does Humanae Vitae say? Well, first of all, in terms of basic guidance, and I'll come into this in just a moment, it's going to emphasize throughout that marriage is sacred, and that marriage, essential to marriage, is the sexual act, and that the sexual act is procreative. That just as God has drawn them together, and that they are to be completely mutually self-giving to one another, bound together in love, that the couple comes together, becoming one flesh, and that is by definition procreative. It also is certainly for intimacy, and that is affirmed in this as well, but it has to be both, according to the teachings of the Catholic Church. Why? Partly because when people are married, God is intimately a part of that marriage. God is involved in their marriage and remains so, and God is involved in the sexual act. They enter into partnership with God when they do this. All right, so let me mention just a few things here, and time's going to run out quickly for me, so I want to make sure I do this quickly. This divine gift, this is the sexual act, you cannot deprive it, even partially, of its meaning and purpose. And to do so is to oppose the plan of God and His holy will. To experience the gift of married love includes now these laws of conception and this recognition that you are not the master of the sources of life, that you do not have unlimited dominion over your body or over control of your body. This is very fitting, of course. I love that we refer to it as birth control, right? This is an idea that the Catholic Church would firmly reject. You are not in control of birth. God is the one that's in control of birth. And the only way in which you can be in control of birth, according to Humanae Vitae, is by abstaining or by using your logical faculty and by natural rhythms and trying the rhythm method. That is all that they allow. That is all that is officially allowed in Humanae Vitae. Now, you may well look at this and say, wow, that is pretty hard to do, to put it mildly. It's hard for young people. It's hard in the developing world with problems of overpopulation. It's hard economically. And sure enough, Humanae Vitae acknowledges all of this. It acknowledges all of these challenges, including the fear of young people becoming pregnant, including the challenges for families with many kids that are born. What is its response? Its response is essentially that birth is not supposed to be easy. Don't expect that giving life or raising a child is always easy. It is not intended to be. But it is a gift. And it is the purpose of marriage and the purpose of the sexual act. All right. Also, and here I should mention with this piece beneath, they recognize that many people would be critical. And rather than avoiding this criticism, they embraced it. Recognize now that Jesus, of course, the divine founder, was a sign of contradiction. They shouldn't, as the church, seek to be any less. And also that it's not the church's job to change and to change to meet culture. Rather, the church serves as a guardian and interpreter of the laws and teachings and traditions that it's inherited. And this now is how this issue is seen. I should also mention one other issue, and this comes from an earlier encyclical written in the 1930s, which was dealing a lot with the problem of eugenics. Eugenics was very popular during that period, this idea of limiting birth so that only the right people would be born, only the best people would be born. This was actually a very popular idea in 1900 to the 1930s. It thankfully went very heavily out of disfavor, of course, after Nazi Germany. Now, with this whole issue of eugenics, which was at a high point in this period, the Pope again made an encyclical. And at the time, people were being sterilized who, for instance, were seen as insane, who were seen as criminals, who were sexually licentious, who were poor, who were less intelligent, you name it. It was a pretty unpleasant and disturbing period. The church's response is that all life is sacred. And also, it fundamentally changed the question by emphasizing that children, when they're born, and human beings when they're born, they are not born for life on this earth. When we are born instead for heaven. A fundamentally different distinction. So rather than worrying about whether somebody is the smartest or whether they're going to have birth defects in this world that might limit their life, the church's emphasis instead is no, life is born for the heavenly realm, not for this life. A fundamentally different way of approaching this question. All right, so all of this is background to why the church reacts as they do to a question like the Zika virus. Let me talk very briefly, and I'm not going to go through all this text, don't worry. Let me comment very briefly, though, on this issue of health crises. We look at something like the Zika virus. This is an important crisis. It is. It is a very important health crisis. But one of the things you have to understand when you look at an issue like the Catholic Church and its responses to this is the Catholic Church has a very long view. It has a very long view as it engages these issues. It does not change easily. And great example, dramatic example of a much, much bigger health crisis, namely that of the Black Death. The Black Death now came as a health crisis, particularly now 1347, all the way up until 1350, slightly after, and then recurring for many, many centuries in lesser form. When the Black Death hits Europe, more than a third of the population is killed within a very short period of time. To make matters even worse, it's not evenly distributed. So some cities are entirely wiped out, other places barely touched. And when this happens, it was not just a health crisis. It threatened every aspect of society. Everything broke down. Economy broke down, family structure broke down, government broke down. Everything had completely fallen apart. And in the midst of this, it's interesting to see the reactions of the Pope at the time, a Pope who, by the way, is not a very praiseworthy figure in most regards, but with his response to the plague, actually had some pretty impressive moments. And he's dealing now with a slightly different issue, namely the end of life, rather than the beginning of life. But again, while he makes allowances, he doesn't fundamentally change any of the teachings of the Catholic Church. So, in the plague, and during this period, they had all sorts of problems with last rites for the dead, because people were dying so rapidly. There weren't enough priests to go and care for them. Priests, understandably, many of them were fleeing, not wanting to have anything to do with it. The ones who were going and ministering often died as a result. So, severe situation. His response to this is that he continues to encourage priests to go. He also allows now anyone to perform last rites. He recognizes that priests can't always be there. Any person is allowed to perform last rites. People, if they're alone, are even allowed to cry out to God and pronounce their sins. And when it was so difficult to bury people, because it wasn't possible to have sacred burials in grounds that had been consecrated, people started dumping people in the rivers, throwing them into mass graves. What was his response? He proceeded to sanctify the entirety of the River Rhone, so that people could throw the bodies into the river, and that it would be seen as sacred ground. Also, rather interestingly, in the midst of this crisis, when everything was falling apart, he pronounced a bull, a very formal statement, actually defending the Jewish people, which was astonishing, particularly giving attitudes towards Judaism in the period. Because Christians had started blaming the Jews for this, they even started suggesting that some Jews had poisoned wells, and that they were responsible for the Black Death. And he now comes out in their defense, and he is going to say a lot of horrible things about Judaism, but he comes out very, very firmly against Christians killing Jews, even under the penalty of excommunication. So, huge health crisis. Important to note here, it's not like the theology of the church suddenly changed, even in this extremely radical health crisis. So, let me come now back to this final question. What can we expect? What can you realistically expect of the church in the midst of these circumstances, in the midst of these situations? And what, if anything, may we have learned from trying to talk about a topic like this? Well, first of all, I would say many of us, when we encounter a topic like this, it looks like one of those situations where shouldn't there be an easy solution? Shouldn't the church just relax its position, allow condom use, which is already happening widely in these places anyway? Shouldn't it even allow for abortion immediately after conception? Because after all, the world's changing, right? And isn't that our expectation of how medical things should happen? Short answer, particularly when you look at the theology of the Catholic Church, when you look at its long history, these are very important issues. These are issues that have to do with life, with creation itself. These are core issues for the Catholic Church. These are not things that's likely to suddenly change. And there are good reasons for why it does so. And the church does not feel the need to adapt to modern times or even to crises, as much as we might want it to do so. Now, I would also say that the Catholic Church challenges people's assumptions about what birth is and what life is all about. It's going to have a different perspective on these issues, and one that is certainly interesting to reflect on. But, and this is an important but, you can expect that somebody like Pope Francis, as usual, is going to startle everyone. Startle them by saying things that are surprising, challenging, and undoubtedly will act in ways that are surprising and challenging. And while I do not expect the Catholic Church is suddenly going to change its position, I don't expect it to suddenly make this health crisis any easier for us, as much as we might want it to do so. What you can probably expect is that this will invite ongoing conversation. And especially with Pope Francis's comments now, the Catholic Church will continue to reflect on this. Reflect whether this is an exceptional case in which the Church should get involved and can and should make some allowances. All right, I'll stop there for now. There's so much more that I would love to say, but I wanted to allow at least a few minutes for questions. Thank you, by the way, all for being attentive.